I am here with Alex Jacob, Communications Manager at the International Federation of the Phonographic Industry, or the IFPI. So, hi Alex, and it's great to have you on the show.
Pleasure to be here.
So, first of all, would you like to give us a little bit of a background on the IFPI for the listeners who may not be familiar with the work of this organization?
Sure. IFPI represents the recorded music industry worldwide. We've got more than 1,400 members, both large and small, in over 70 countries. And we work with affiliate organizations in 45 countries around the world. For example, RIAA in the United States or BPI in the UK. And we work to represent them in a number of ways, tackling anti-piracy issues at the coalface, working to lobby governments to improve the situation for record companies worldwide, and working to promote the uses of recorded music, particularly in terms of public performance rights and broadcast rights, to ensure that artists, songwriters and producers get a fair price for their products.
And the IFPI has been very busy in the past few years having to deal with the piracy issues. How has the outlook evolved over the past 10 years? And how rocky has the path been in understanding the phenomenon?
Well, it's true to say that piracy has always been part of the music industry since the early days of vinyl. Certainly in the 1990s, we found that about 1 in 3 CDs sold worldwide was a counterfeit with no money going back to the artist or the record company. And then, of course, you had the development of the internet, and piracy levels just exploded. And our research suggests that about 95% of music downloads worldwide are unlicensed and illegal, and with no money going back to the artist, the songwriter, or the record company. So you've seen there that the volume of piracy has climbed enormously, and an industry that always had to live with a quite high level of piracy has now got stratospheric levels. And that, of course, means that it's much more difficult for a record label to get a return on its investment, which in turn means that it's more difficult to invest money in the next generation of talent, to uncover the artists that are out there rehearsing in their garage and hoping to get their big break and sign a record deal.
Sure.
So the levels have changed immensely.
On the IFPI Digital Music Report, piracy is indicated, as you mentioned, as the most important barrier to growth, and it stifles both sales and investments in new music. So what do you think is the main driver of piracy, and if reports indicating that many pirates also purchase music legally are actually accurate, how do you get them to stop using P2P networks altogether and go 100% legal? Is there a need for a better value proposition?
Well, the overwhelming reason for piracy is that it's access for free music. I mean, research has been done in country after country, year after year, and the main driver of people using file-sharing networks is they want to get music for free, and you can understand that. The other part of the equation, of course, is that there is no real penalty, a lot of people think, for using these networks. There have been high-profile lawsuits, but in terms of the number of people accessing music illegally to the number of lawsuits that were taken back when that was an active policy, a lot of people felt that they weren't actually going to get any consequence for their actions. So music was free, they weren't going to be stopped from taking it, and that was really a major driver. And of course, alongside that, you've had the rollout of broadband around the world over the last 10 years. And of course, faster broadband connections have enabled higher piracy rates. So that's the kind of environment we're operating in. You mentioned there that surveys have shown that some illegal file sharers also buy music, and that's absolutely true. We've never said there's no crossover, but that research has also suggests that music fans that file share tend to buy less music than music fans that don't. So there is still an issue of lost revenues. Yeah. There's no real universal agreement as to what's called the substitution rate. In other words, if that music wasn't available on these file-sharing networks, how much it would actually be either bought as individual tracks or accessed through services like Spotify. Yeah. And nobody can really agree whether that's 1%, 10%, 50%, 100%. But even if you look at the sort of lower end of that scale, when you consider there are more than 40 billion single tracks downloaded illegally every year, even 1 or 2% would convert into quite a lot of extra revenue going into the music industry.
Sure.
You also asked there about how we can hopefully change people's behavior. really what the recorded music industry is looking for is to migrate people from illegal sites, file sharing sites, onto legal services. And they may not necessarily be paid for a la carte download services like iTunes or Amazon. They may be free at the point of use services such as YouTube or Spotify, but services that nonetheless are licensed and pay some money back into the record companies, the artists and the songwriters.
And the IFPI is an international organization. And whilst in the UK there is a lot of P2P file sharing going on, we're also in a far better shape than other countries in terms of the evolution of new business models and their adoption by the public. So what countries around Europe or worldwide worry you the most when it comes to piracy?
Well, in terms of sheer volume of piracy, China is overwhelmingly the number one country to worry about. It has the potential to be such a fantastic market for the recorded music industry. Obviously, a large population, rapidly growing wealth there, increasing incomes. And it should be a market where there's increasing investment in music and great new Chinese acts being discovered and broken, not just in China, but around the world. But actually, we find that outside of Hong Kong and Taiwan, if you look at mainland China, that sort of development is not happening. New legal services are not happening because of the high rates of piracy there, both file sharing and the sort of services that are run to allow people to deep link into infringing files. So certainly a problem in China. It's at the moment an area of great potential, but potential that can't really be tapped until the Chinese government steps up really its enforcement levels and creates a much better environment for intellectual property and for record companies to do business.
And on a European level, where do you think the highest levels of piracy are at the moment?
Well, traditionally in Europe, the major problem has been with Russia and the Ukraine, where piracy takes place not just in the file sharing sites, but also obviously in the illegal and unlicensed download sites that actually offer music for sale to consumers from Western Europe at very low prices. And of course, they offer those very low prices because they don't have to pay the artist, songwriter, or record company. So that's been a long-standing problem. We have had some successes there. We have worked with companies such as Visa and MasterCard to ensure that they're not enabling people to use these illegal services. They're withdrawing their facilities. And that has certainly hit services such as all of mp3.com, which was the largest of these types of illegal service. But certainly file sharing is a problem across Europe. Rates, I think, are highest in Spain and generally of the major markets lowest in Germany, but there's no country that's immune from the problem, which is indeed why you've had politicians from President Sarkozy in France to Lord Mandelson in the UK trying to tackle the problem through legislation.
And you were at the Music Connected event a couple of weeks ago, which was focused on independent labels. So how does the IFPI deal with independent labels as opposed to dealing with majors? Is there a difference on how you approach them?
No, many of our members are independent record companies, but certainly in the UK, where AIM organised that conference, if you're an AIM member or you're a PPL member or a BPI member, then the IAPU, our Internet Antipiracy Unit, offers its facilities to you. You just need to register your repertoire with us, and if you go onto the IFPI website, you can find details of how to do that. And we treat the repertoire of independent companies exactly as we would the repertoire of major companies. We want to see unlicensed music stopped. We want to see people migrate to legal services that indies and majors have licensed. Really, we find that if people that are engaged in illegal file sharing don't distinguish between the repertoire of majors and independents, they don't feel that they shouldn't download the Arctic Monkeys, but it's okay to download Snow Patrol. And we likewise, don't discriminate between the repertoire of majors and indies.
And you were talking about the Antipiracy unit. How do you keep on top of what's happening in the digital world and on who is swapping which files? Have you developed your own technology to track the file sharing, or do you rely on third-party companies?
Well, the Internet Anti-Piracy Unit does run its own tracking services. It also cooperates with third parties, with commercial companies. Some of that work is automated, some of that work is manual. At a very basic level, it's very simple for members of the anti-piracy unit to log on to file sharing networks just as you or I could and see which IP numbers are being used to upload copyright infringing material. And certainly in the past, where there have been lawsuits against people that have been uploading either pre-release material or serious amounts of infringing music, it's that very basic way that the evidence has been gathered, and that evidence has been accepted in courts across Europe and indeed worldwide. And it is that form of evidence that would also really be part of the graduated response approach that's set out in the legislation that's passed in France and the UK and that other countries are considering.
And you've been supporting the idea of graduated response worldwide, really, towards piracy. And in the UK, finally, we have had the Digital Economy Act introduced. So do you think this is what we need in the UK? Are you happy with the way it's been formulated? Or is there anything that you would have wanted to be different about it?
We're very supportive of the Digital Economy Act and likewise the Hadopi law in France across the Channel. We certainly believe that other countries should look at similar legislation. In the past, as I mentioned earlier, the recording industry has taken out lawsuits against individuals that have uploaded large amounts of copyright infringing material. But we really believe graduated response is a more proportionate and effective way of tackling piracy. We don't want to take people to court. Nobody joined a record company because they want to take end users to court. They join a record company because they want to make and promote great music. And therefore, we need people to be migrating to the legal sites, the sites that pay revenue back to the record companies that they can invest in the artists. And graduated response is a much more effective way of doing that. We believe that an awful lot of people will actually switch from illegal to legal services on receipt of their notification that they'll get from their ISP. The first time people have been actually tapped on the shoulder to say, look, we know you're using unlicensed services, but actually there are great free services out there, as well as download stores and subscription services, and you should consider those, because if you don't, there'll be some form of sanction. We think people will then take a second look at the legal services, and that actually the number of people that will go through repeated warnings and then face some perhaps kind of temporary account suspension at the end of that process, there'll be very, very few. In France, for example, research by Ipsos suggested that 90% of infringing file sharers would switch by the second warning. So there's a possibility here of migrating people to legal services, increasing the revenue that comes into the recording industry, and actually introducing people to some great services that are out there.
And the IFPI has had a fairly rocky relationship with the ISPs through the years, because ISPs were fairly resistant in cooperating with the labels, in large part to protect the customers. So what is your relationship with ISPs today? Has it gotten any better?
Well, of course, you mentioned ISPs. That covers a huge range of companies, and there are different relationships with different ISPs out there. Broadly speaking, you're absolutely right. The relationship has been at some points rocky. Certainly John Kennedy, our former chief executive, again and again felt he was being filibustered by ISPs, not because they particularly wanted to protect their consumers, but because they wanted to protect their profits. They were charging, high fees for monthly access to rapid broadband, and that wasn't to make people's emails go faster. It was because people wanted to access content, and a lot of that content was unlicensed and illegal, and it wasn't really in the ISP's interest to migrate people to legal services. Certainly as part of a voluntary agreement, a lot of ISPs privately said to us as an industry, look, we understand where you're coming from, but if we signed a deal with you, our consumers may go over to a company that doesn't sign a deal with you, and therefore, will effectively be gifting some of our users to the competition. And you can understand that. That's indeed why John Kennedy led the campaign for governments to become involved and introduce rules across the playing field, so that you couldn't have rogue players effectively marketing themselves as available and open for piracy. And now the situation with ISPs is changing quite rapidly. You have some ISPs, for example, Sky in the UK, that are launching their own music services. They realize that actually as competition hots up, as broadband penetration saturates, the future is not just in selling the access, but in selling services. And so, as I say, in the UK, you have services like Sky Songs. In Denmark, TDC became the first ISP worldwide to sign a deal with all the major and independent recording companies to run its own music service. And lots of other ISPs are interested in that model. So we're coming into an age where the government in many countries is taking a look at this area, and the ISP's own commercial interests in this area are changing. So that does bode well for the future.
And the IFPI works in partnership with the national organizations like the BPI, for example. Do you have separate agendas and objectives, or do you work together?
We absolutely work together. For example, in September, agents from BPI, IFPI, and various other national groups across the world will be meeting in Italy for a conference to share best practice. We have common interests, common members, and we work hand in glove on a day-to-day basis. IFPI offers all the support that it can to its national groups and obviously to its individual record company members. We work very closely with them. We keep them informed of all the work that we do on their behalf, particularly on pre-release piracy, which can be so damaging to record companies, whether they're indies or majors.
And finally, the IFPI will continue to promote legal avenues to sell and consume music and to fight piracy at the same time. So what's your roadmap as an organization, and what are your plans for the near future?
Well, record companies have licensed more than 12 million tracks to around 400 legal services worldwide. We don't get involved in the individual commercial negotiations. That's not our role at all. And indeed, that would be contrary to competition law. But we do say that as an industry, we're looking to license music to fans, that they can access on any device at any time, and a huge variety of business models, whether they want to buy individual tracks or albums a la carte, whether they want to bundle music in with their mobile phone or their broadband bill, whether they're interested in streaming or downloading. We really believe that this marketplace has a great potential future. If we can curb piracy, hopefully through the graduated response, and move people onto legal services, then more and more entrepreneurs should become interested in the sector, and consumers will get more and more choice. And of course, revenue will flow back into record companies so that they can invest in the next generation of artists and songwriters. So we really want to get into that virtuous circle.
That's fantastic. Well, thank you very much for being on the show. And
absolute pleasure.
Cool. Have a great day.
Thank you, and you.